Johnson. Good morning.
3 days, a couple hours each night. Then I might, yeah.
Let's get started here. First of all, welcome to the home stretch of this amazing conference. I thank everyone for their participation and all the sponsors of this conference. Our session this morning is going to dig into the question of how can we get more private capital used to effectively create opportunities and address areas of disinvestment. And how can we use the public sector resources to leverage this private capital? I think it's a very opportune moment to be talking about this. There is growing interest in impact investing, seeking financial returns with social returns. This year's tax legislation included a tax benefit called Opportunity Zones that we'll dig into. And finally, there's a growing market for venture capital to help drive innovation in cities across the country. We have a terrific panel here this morning, and I want to say that everyone here has deep experience in the private sector and financial markets, as well as a strong public policy interest in driving these kinds of investments. To my left is Bill Chen. He is the Deputy Mayor of the City of Los Angeles for Economic Development. His responsibilities are so broad, I'm not going to begin to list all of them, but trust me, he covers a lot of territory in the City of Los Angeles. He joined the mayor's office in 2013, and before that worked in private financial markets as an investment manager. Terry Ludwig has been the CEO since 2011 of Enterprise Community Partners. And I'm sure, like me, you've welcomed so many of her colleagues who've been part of this conference over the last several days. This is a national nonprofit that works in communities across the country with deep expertise in community development. Before joining Enterprise Community Partners, Terry had decades of experience in the private sector, including at Merrill Lynch's Community Development Company, Credit Suisse, Axion, a nonprofit microlender, and other experience that's relevant here. And last but not least, we have David Hall joining us, who is a partner in the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund, which is part of the venture capital firm Revolution based in Washington, D.C. David has been there since 2005, the beginning, and has been involved in a broad campaign across the country to drive more venture capital into underrepresented areas. So without further ado, and by the way, I'm Mary Miller. I have the privilege of a seat at the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. My background is here in Baltimore, though. I spent 26 years at T. Rowe Price working in the investment management industry, and then 5 years at the US Treasury following the financial crisis. So all of us here have both private sector and public sector experience, and our goal today is to try to talk about, in a hopefully informal way, how we can do things better to drive more private capital into areas that need it. So I'm going to ask each of you to just take a couple minutes and tell us a little bit about your organization. I've given a high-level overview, but tell us what you do every day.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Bill, you're up.
I'll start. Good morning, everyone. Billy Chen again. So I work for Mayor Eric Garcetti. He is the mayor of the city of Los Angeles. I oversee his economic development initiatives. There's always something going on in the city of Los Angeles. So, to put it plainly, I kind of bucket my duties in terms of internal and external within City Hall. So internally within City Hall, I oversee a few departments on the mayor's behalf, and that includes the airport. If you have any good experiences with the airport, you could tell me. If you have any bad experiences, you can tell the mayor. So I oversee the airport, the Port of Los Angeles, our planning department, building and safety, our convention center, and our economic development department. And then the other bucket externally, I consider my constituents the private sector, so the companies that we work with either to grow, create jobs, bring investment, bring tourism, and just basically charged with growing the economy. And that varies day to day, but generally my priorities align with what the mayor wants. Other than that, I kind of fill in the blanks and try to kind of grow what we can.
Great.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Great to see everyone. I'm Terry Ludwig, and I'm the CEO of Enterprise Community Partners. As Mary said, we are a nonprofit organization. Probably think of us as a social enterprise. And what we essentially do is, we're committed to our mission of ensuring that every low and moderate income family in this country has access to a safe, healthy, affordable home in a thriving, diverse community. That's our mission statement. We're working at it. We really strive to be the premier partner to someone like Billy, who's trying to drive economic development, and know that in order to do that, that housing and your community is really front and center in that equation. We do this really through three main ways, which you'll hear today as we start to talk. We really base everything that we do on public-private partnerships. So we have really, this is an interesting conversation for that reason. And as I'm talking, just think about, we have this three-legged stool, if you will, in terms of how we work. So we aggregate and leverage capital and bring that into communities. And we bring about $8 billion into communities across the country each year. We've done about $36 billion since we've started. That's debt and equity in all kinds of forms to really make communities stronger. Secondly, we have what we call kind of our programmatic work, our solutions on the ground, where we're trying to address specific issues, whether it's housing like homelessness, or it's the intersection of housing and transportation, or healthcare, or jobs, or education, that kind of full opportunity framework. And we work across the country and go deep in many communities across the country. And really the third leg of the stool for us is policy. As we said, public-private partnerships require us, in order to scale our business, one of the ways we do that is through removing barriers through policy, but also scaling through policy. That's the systems change that allows us to get to much bigger scale. So those are the three things that, I'll be talking a lot about today, and it's great to be here.
David.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. My name is David Hall. I'm a partner at Revolution. Revolution is a Washington, D.C. based venture capital firm. We've got about $1.3 billion under management. I specialize in what we call the Rise of the Rest Fund. It's a special fund that invests in early stage opportunities, and we particularly use the lens of geography as our primary way to look at opportunities. So our fund invests over 90% of our capital outside of Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York City, which has historically been the epicenter of venture capital. And our belief in this is that great entrepreneurs can start great companies anywhere. And we want to really accelerate that trend of getting capital in places like Charleston or Madison or Miami or Bend, Oregon, because we think that both from an opportunistic point of view, but also from a holistic point of view, having startups succeed in those areas are really, really important to both our economy, but also we think, and on behalf of our investors, we think that that's a really good investment bet. And so we're really excited to talk about that. One of the things that we've done throughout the last couple of years is we've been actually on tour. We had, the chairman of our firm, Steve Case, has started this Rise of the Rest bus tour where we go to different cities. We'll typically do 5 cities in 5 days. And when we're in a city, The last tour started in Dallas and ended in Louisville. And we would talk to all of the important stakeholders, from university presidents to startup support organizations to the startups themselves, and ask them, how can we accelerate the investment in entrepreneurship, the investment in startups in your local town? And it's just been really rewarding to see both the investments that have been spawned from these bus tours, but also, and more importantly, the engagement and the momentum that this movement is starting to take as we've toured across the country. So excited to talk about that, and really grateful to be here.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's ask Billy, if you could give us an example from Los Angeles of a public-private partnership that could maybe fill out the bones of what we're talking about here.
Sure, and I'll preface it by saying we've relied on P3, that P3 model, just more and more, just for, I'd imagine for a lot of the municipalities around the country, it's hard to get things done when you're trying to be fiscally responsible and balance the city's budget and provide basic city services and put police officers on the street. It's not like you have a lot of money at hand to do economic development initiatives or even infrastructure projects. And you don't want to extend the city's borrowing capacity, so you got to think of creative ways. So now we're relying heavily on P3. I kind of think of it as, kind of two areas that we focus on. One is kind of the investment in the physical plant or just the physical space, and that's generally infrastructure. And so right now, with the airport, we're going through a $4 billion redevelopment and kind of reimagining what that airport is going to be like. So in 4 or 5 years, and definitely before the Olympics arrive in LA, it's going to look a lot different. In between then, there'll be some kind of delays and traffic. Just bear with us, but we'll have that airport will connect to a public transit line. We'll have a people mover, a tram, and it'll just relieve a lot of the traffic congestion inside what we call the central terminal area, which is kind of right in front of the terminals. And so, we went through a P3 process a couple of months ago. We awarded the largest city contract ever, just over $1 billion, to a consortium that's doing our people mover. And we could not have done it any other way except this route, both on the financing capacity and obviously the construction and operation. We just don't have the resources. We don't know how to build a people mover, so obviously we're relying on the private sector a lot. We're doing the same model for redeveloping and expanding our convention center. We're actually going through this same exercise to redevelop our civic center where our city hall is, and reutilize and maybe add more density to where a lot of our civic buildings are. So we're growing with that. And plus, just recently, the voters passed a ballot initiative to tax themselves, who would have thought, half-cent sales tax for public transit and to fund public transit. It's the largest infrastructure project in this country, times two, $120 billion over 40 years. And so we're going to grow our, kind of public transportation. We don't have as great of a public transit as New York or kind of other parts of the country, but we're definitely going to be there. And so we're relying heavily on that. And, we also think of those as job creators. There's going to be a lot of jobs, both construction and operational jobs, that will be created from those infrastructure projects. And just very quickly, the other side of it is just the investment in human capital. So again, we're relying on the private sector a lot to fund and be thought partners for a lot of our initiatives, whether it's on homelessness, whether it's on providing universal access to youth sports in the city of Los Angeles, whether it's providing summer youth jobs to all of the Angelenos that attend public school systems. And we focus particularly on the tech sector and the entertainment industry, kind of bringing those kids into internships and eventually jobs in those industries. So, we've got a lot of ideas, and thankfully we've got a lot of great private sector partners to kind of come with us on that journey.
Thank you. David, you mentioned that you've been on a tour of the country, and I understand you've visited over 40 cities.
The tour has, I didn't make
You
quite
didn't
all
go
of
to
it.
all of them, okay, all right.
Come on,
Yet.
David.
Yet.
Yeah, definitely going back.
We appreciate honesty, thank you. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what are sort of the key ingredients for creating a hospitable place for growth?
Yeah, sure.
Who are the partners that you see? Do you have any good examples to share where different members of the private sector, public sector, academic, perhaps are coming together to help foster growth for the type of investments you're making?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with what I think is part of the critical catalyst in the flywheel, and that's universities, right? It's such a source of new blood and new sort of DNA into a city, because that's what they do. They attract people, students, teachers, faculty from around the world. They come into the city with their new ideas and inject just this new drive into the city, both from a just human capital perspective, but also from an entrepreneurship perspective. And it really is, we've seen the catalyst to getting that flywheel moving. And it's so important to have the university, not just from universities typically have two things that really work. They've got people and they've got space. And one of the key things for getting startups and getting an entrepreneurship ecosystem built is space. People need a place to hang out. Silicon Valley is as much a place for people to gather and just sort of go have coffee and kombucha as much as it is a place for them to start companies on napkins. And so the ability to have this sort of this epicenter in their city to go to whenever somebody says, I want to start a business, it's important to have that place. The second big aspect that universities are able to provide is the curriculum. And I think if there's one place to start thinking ahead is how do you reimagine a curriculum that is entrepreneurship first as opposed to training for sort of white-collar jobs of the future, because as we all know, those are quickly changing. And so being able to reinfuse and redo the curriculum, that's really important. To continue to answer your question, Mary, the other things that we really see that are critical are public servants like Billy leaning into this new wave and really being supportive. A lot of times you see public servants who only really want to, well, not only, but really focus on recruiting another company to come into their city. They want to change the headquarters. And that's basically, so that'll be great, right? So a big company moves from one city and lands in another city, same number of jobs, same type of opportunity, but new growth, new jobs, new opportunity typically comes from startups. And it's great to support big businesses, small businesses hire and train and sort of accommodate more Americans than anything else. But net new job growth comes from and is sort of cornerstone by startups and the creation of those new startups. And then the final piece on this that really creates these ecosystems and makes them sort of work great is that one or two or small cadre of visionary leaders who can pull the private capital off of the sidelines, find the high net worth individuals that are willing to take risks on these new investors, pull the community leaders into the conversation, pull the academic institutions, help notify and engage the general business community all into this movement. And that usually coalesces around one or two people who've taken the flag and they're saying, I'm going to champion startups in Dallas or in Oklahoma City. And that's sort of how that flywheel starts to work and move.
Terrific. Well, just continuing for a moment on this theme of partnership, Terry, I know you have some great examples in particular fields like housing and healthcare. Could you give us an example of a partnership you've seen that's worked, where you've drawn in private capital and participation?
Sure, Mary, thanks. So I would say at Enterprise, everything we do is through partnership, right? And that's our whole model. And so we have lots of great examples of partnerships that really work. I think where I've been spending a lot of my time, which has been very interesting, is with, like we said, we lead with housing because we believe that's so fundamental. And it's interesting, I've got Billy to my right, and I got David to my left. And, whether it's a big business coming into a community or a new business enterprise at whatever scale, what you just heard Billy say is we've got to think about homelessness. We have to think about the basics of how this is going to play out, not in just a single community or a single socioeconomic place, but across the spectrum. So my job is to kind of look at the low and moderate income phase and say, okay, what happens when that comes in? How do we make sure that we have healthy residents and healthy communities and folks that are going to thrive in those communities? So really the partnerships I'm looking at as, as that is infrastructure is being built out or those businesses are created, how do we partner particularly with some of those anchor institutions to bring them into the equation, because it does take that private capital with the public capital. And one of the areas I've been most involved recently has been with the health sector. And I was fortunate enough to, I have my chairman of my board, Ron Terwilliger, here, who's awesome. And yay, Ron, I'm looking right at him. And we have another great board member, too, that I'd want to reference, which is Dr. Megan Sandel, who's a pediatrician. And we brought her on our board because I realized that, when we're talking about health, the healthcare sector, doctors, that's where I'm spending my time, because they're saying, guess what? I cannot keep that child healthy if they don't have a safe, affordable home in a good community. So increasingly, people are looking at, like, all these issues are connected, so the solutions have to be as well. So the healthcare sector, whether you're an anchor institution, your health system, or you're an insurer, or you're a doctor, we're all looking at this same family and child saying, how do we help them to advance? So what we've seen is it's in your business interest from many perspectives to invest in the communities and the people that we serve. So for example, we've worked for a long time with a very large insurer, and they're investing with us. They invested $100 million with us in the low-income housing tax credit business, which is the primary sort of vehicle we use to develop affordable housing. We've also more recently been working with some health systems. As many of you who know, the health system, there's kind of two pockets of money they have. The community benefits money, right, that has to go directly to the community. But they're also sitting on this huge stack of pension assets and treasury assets, which absolutely have fiduciary responsibilities that we have to respond to. But they also have the business imperative to make their business strong. Their business is going to be stronger. If you're a health insurer, you're going to have better business results if you're helping keep the people that you're insuring healthy and those communities are strong. You're probably competing for like a state mandate as well, right? So there's all sorts of reasons. And so we're doing a lot of work to think about how do we get better outcomes for residents? How do we lower healthcare utilization costs through these partnerships? And embed metrics in some of the capital structures. For example, we're launching a debt and equity fund with a very large healthcare system that hasn't been announced yet, but it will be all from their pension fund. And this is the first time we're seeing them. They're actually going over the pension side to say, yes, we know that this is a safe, strong investment. I can invest and deliver on a lot of my business objectives that I want, as well as some powerful social objectives. So we're creating a fund that actually will go in and preserve housing, because that's what they want to do. They know they can't keep someone healthy, and they'll just return right back to the emergency room if they're not getting the right health care. So it's going out and preserving housing in their catchment area where they work, and we're embedding a lot of the data to say, are we getting it right? We're going to do resident surveys. We're looking at healthcare utilization. We're looking at the outcomes. So those are the types of things that we're doing. So a really interested blending approach, but driving business outcomes, but absolutely public-private partnerships that allow us to achieve objectives and get better business results.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can leave without a discussion about opportunity zones. This is a feature of the tax legislation that was passed this year, and I know it's come up in a number of the conversations over the last couple days. And I think one of the key questions we should talk about is the potential for opportunity zones, the pros and cons that you see. But I'd like to ask Billy if you could maybe tell us how the city of Los Angeles is thinking about this, and how does a city develop, I call it the playbook, if you will, for opportunity zones to make sure that we're getting investment in the right places?
Yeah, I mean, I could personally say I'm very nervous about it, and I'm very anxious about it. Obviously, there's a lot of potential there. I think I'm more concerned, and I think a lot of people are, just about how it's actually implemented. I mean, all of a sudden you have a lot of capital, either on the sideline, dry powder, just ready to kind of deploy it in a community, in a neighborhood that's very specific and has a lot of potential to change. And, you just want to be sure you have the right partners in place there. So, we've actually thought about this a lot. The mayor has created a nonprofit called the Accelerator of America, and they've done a lot of work with EIG and the group that's working on this. And just a few months ago, we had the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky over in LA, and at Sean Parker's house, and just talked about, LA's needs are not, very just contained. I mean, our issues, what we're facing in LA is kind of out there for everyone. And so what Louisville is facing, we're facing as well. So there's a lot of kind of shared experiences and just shared perspectives on how we're going to go about this. And I think the common theme that came up there was, for any fund or any investor from Oz's that are going into a city, they absolutely need a local partner. What makes me particularly nervous is that local municipalities have, right now, as of now, no role, no say into how those funds are deployed, or just anything. I mean, we're just not a party at all. But I think there needs to be a local partner, either a nonprofit, a local organization, just to guide that investment and kind of really offer opinions of how you invest, who to include, potential community benefits that can be on top of just actually owning something, like local hiring or local contract opportunities, or workforce opportunities. I think there's a lot of tangible benefits there that could benefit, obviously, not only the community, but the investor as well, in order to kind of make that investment thrive and be an actual true partner in the community. So, what we talked about was putting together these playbooks of not just only marketing investment sites, which we started, but also how to go about it. And so I've talked to a lot of managers and a lot of high net worth individuals that are really ready to kind of jump in. I think there's still a lot of things to be worked out on the Treasury side for guidance, but as soon as that's in place, they are literally ready to jump in. And so what I'm hoping for is working with a particular investment, potentially in South Los Angeles, and partnering with them and being very public about it and talking about this is the way to do it. For any other fund or manager, bank that's out there interested in doing an Oz in LA, this is how you do it. So, I hope to be very public and very transparent just about that whole process from beginning to end.
Terry, could I ask you to also jump in on this? I know your organization has thought a lot about opportunity zones, so any pros and cons or perspective that you could share here?
Sure. We've been focused on opportunity zones similarly from the beginning. First of all, on the policy side, as the opportunity zones came out, because it's very different than what we've seen before with some of the programs we use that are programs. For those of you who don't know it, it's a tax benefit. So there's not a lot of regulatory guidance wrapped around it. So when we talk about some of the concerns we have, it comes from the thought that there's maybe $6 trillion sitting on the sidelines of capital gains that are going to potentially be unleashed, right, into communities that have been designated opportunity zones. What proportion of that will actually come off the sidelines, we will see. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said, he expects $100 billion in, I'm not sure what time frame he said, but that's in, relatively in the coming years. So, our concern at Enterprise is that how do we make sure that that really benefits those that legislation was intended for, which are the existing businesses and residents of those communities, and that you don't further displacement. And so that's what we're working on. And so we're trying to make sure that when we're looking at regulations that are going to be forthcoming maybe in about a month or so, that it gives as clear guidance as possible, and that we have as much transparency as we can in who's investing in these funds, what are they investing in, what are the data we're collecting, what are the kind of impact measures. As of right now, there's not a lot of requirements. And in fact, if I'm an investor and I want to invest in a single asset that Billy needs, I can just self-certify that this is an investment, opportunity zone investment. Is that the right policy or not?
Yeah.
right? That's one of the things that's being debated right now because, as Mary well knows, having been in a very executive role in the Department of Treasury, you know, a lot of these things typically run through Treasury to say, yes, there's a good guy principle here. They met some test as a fund manager. That's not how it's set up today. We'll see how it ends up being set up. So I testified before the Joint Economic Committee, and we're doing a lot of work with Conference of Mayors, with local folks. And well, you know what, basically what we're saying is let's be sure we put some guardrails on this to get good outcomes. The second thing we're doing at Enterprise is making sure that we're using a lot of our data and mapping tools to say, and not only how do we take this and stack it up with other incentives in place to drive the best change that we can. Another thing that we're working on that it's going to be a whole body of work for us is product development. So while some people are very afraid of this and say, no, don't come into my community, we think one of the most powerful things we can do is actually create some very good product, some funds that people can come into that can be more of a gold standard that show, yes, you can help stimulate that economic development but also have very good outcomes. And so we hope to do about $1 billion of opportunity zones in the not too distant future. We did announce recently something which is a $250 million fund called the Emergent Fund. And this is quite different. This is something that is really looking at small town America, 50,000 towns of 50,000 or less in some Southeast, so like in Virginia, in North Carolina, and some other states. And the idea there is to say, part of this, it's going to be very hard. Capital is going to naturally flow into large urban areas, right? Yeah. As David spends his day job working on all these issues, how do we make sure that we're having capital go in and viable strategies in towns across America in the smaller towns? Because that's where capital is not going to naturally flow. So we're identifying about 10 to 12 towns, 50,000 or less, where we feel there is enough economic activity where we can stimulate small business, mixed-use development, and really support that through the new capital flow from opportunity zones. So I could spend a lot of time getting into the detail of this or products. We think it's very exciting, but it's also, we have a lot of, there's a lot of caution that is warranted.
Good. David, you may also have some views on opportunity zones in the realm of work you're doing, but I had a slightly different question to ask you, which was thinking back over the last few months and the Amazon Headquarters 2 competition. Other than disappointing a lot of cities who didn't make the short list, was there some positive impact from that? Was there a convening benefit? Did you see any examples of places starting to think a little bigger in terms of putting their best foot forward?
Absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit about opportunity zones in a second, but it's so amazing to see what Amazon has done for the 300 or so communities around the country. It basically gave them a playbook that says, how can your city be more attractive to young industries, to startups, and how can you create that opportunity in your city? And for the first time in a lot of cities, all of the right stakeholders got in the room to put together the process to bid for this. And it says, you know, and it caused really, really important reflections on, hey, you know what, our transportation infrastructure isn't what it needs to be because nobody wants to commute 2 hours one way to go to work. Hey, you know what, our schools really aren't as competitive as we might have thought they were. Maybe they were more competitive to our regional partner. You know, we were better than, you know, the city 20 miles away, but we're underperforming relative to the national standard that companies like Amazon want for their HQ too. And so it really started creating this dialogue about how can we make our city more attractive? What are the types of incentives that we would want for recruiting high growth startups to come into our area and making our community one of those that is super attractive to the latest engineer that's coming up with the newest application, so they want to come and start it in Nashville, Tennessee. That type of conversation hadn't really happened until Amazon announced the HQ2 process. So I hope, my sincere hope is that two things will happen as a result of this. First, the 290 or whatever losers don't think of themselves as losers, but say, this is the playbook. This is how we can, these are some of the things that we can do to make this attractive. Because guess what? Amazon's looking for its HQ2, but there's a ton of other companies that are going to be looking for their HQ2 or their HQ3, and those playbooks can be dusted off and resubmitted to these new companies as they're looking for new locations, because it's getting really expensive in Silicon Valley to have a headquarters and to recruit people and to retain top talent, because they're saying, I don't want to be 35 years old living in a 3-bedroom apartment with my 4 best friends, right? That's not conducive to building a life that a lot of people would choose to have. And so that's the first. The second thing that I think is also really interesting is it's also putting a playbook in place that says to cities, well, if you, city of whatever, are willing to do all of this for Amazon, let's divide this by 10, let's divide this by 20, and you can do 1/20th of this for 20 different companies, because guess what? The portfolio theory for companies also works just as well for building the next Amazon as it does for us, as we're investing to try to find the next Amazon, because, you know, it's the next Amazon is being built right now. There are 4 or 5 men and women around the conference room or in a garage somewhere building the next Amazon, and if they choose to leave wherever they may be, because I think that they're probably not in Midtown Manhattan or in Soma in San Francisco, if they choose to leave that area and go to one of those epicenters, that's that city's loss. And if there were a little bit of incentive, maybe 6 months of free rent, or, you know, a slate of additional services that can be doled out to these companies as they're in their sort of most important sort of crucible moment, that's how that opportunity can really start to layer on. And we think, just to bridge the conversation, opportunity zones is yet another way, because the lion's share of conversation I've heard about opportunity zones has been focused on real estate. But I think that the guidelines as we know them to be today are totally wide open, and you can look at everything from a, you know, high-tech startup to a coffee shop that would qualify for the financing benefits of the Opportunity Zone tax relief plan. And I just think that this is such a great opportunity for all of us to just put our foot on the accelerator to help drive more capital, more interest, more focus on grooming the next generation of amazing companies.
Thank you for that. Just to come back for a moment on the policy front, we're talking about a law that is now unleashing a tax benefit on the country, and we'll see how it plays out. But there's another thing going on right now, which is a fresh look at the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a 40-year-old law dealing with deposit-taking institutions and lending practices. Terry, anyone on the panel, is there anything that you'd want to say to a policymaker or regulator in Washington about revamping the Community Reinvestment Act to make it work for the issues that we're interested in right here?
Well, I mean, I would just start by saying the Community Reinvestment Act, for those of you not familiar, it requires banks, you know, where they're taking deposits out of a community to reinvest in those communities. So there is a comment period right now that the Controller of the Currency has put out on the Community Reinvestment Act, and it applies to, you know, it applies to banks, traditional banks. It does not apply right now to, you know, non-traditional banks and some other like financial services companies or credit unions.
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of debate as to, you know, how that could be modernized. We know the banking system has changed a lot, right? You're not the local bank taking deposits from your local community. It may be, you know, through a tech platform. So how do we modernize to determine who has a CRA, you know, obligation? What kinds of things can they invest in? You know, as David just said, you know, what's the balance between small business, between real estate, for, you know, among different assets? There's been, you know, some confusion, I think, as you go from regulator to regulator. You know, there's differences in what is valued by various regulators. And as someone who's led a community development effort who, you know, right now 80% of our investors in the low-income housing tax credit in our book of business, where we do about 900 million a year in you know, kind of real estate financing on that platform, 80% of that is driven by Community Reinvestment Act, people who are covered under the Community Reinvestment Act. So that is going to be really important to us to make sure that that is done in a way that continues to incent the kind of behavior and financial investment that we want. Some of the big things that are up for grabs are, you know, how much does a bank need to do and in what asset classes? So is it going to be based off a straight ratio of their assets, you know, investment to assets, or is it going to include things and getting credit for some things that may take more intellectual capital and more for the bank to do that's not just the financial capital? So there's many things that I think could be up for grabs. What I hope is not up for grabs is the notion of, you know, does the Community Reinvestment Act stick around? I'll be knocking on this wood, but that we have not opened a Pandora's box. I would say I think even the banks have discovered that our bank partners are extraordinary, and they're saying, look, we can reinvest in communities and earn good rates of return on a risk-adjusted basis, and many of them are doing way more than they need to do on Community Reinvestment Act basis. They're doing it because it makes really good business on their business and social objectives, which are obviously quite intertwined.
I would just add really quickly that I would also hope, as Terry intimated, that the aperture just gets sufficiently widened. I mean, I think the other thing that's happened in the 50 years since the CRA started is that the metrics by which people can measure and monitor impact have gotten so much more sophisticated, so it doesn't have to necessarily be tied to a certain specific set of criteria and a certain specific zip code, but we can broaden that because now we have the capacity and the language to speak in terms of impact and degrees of impact and measured impact against certain different dimensions. And I think that if we can start to elevate that conversation so that the CRA can be redefined for a new generation, I think it would only benefit and add more value, especially vis-a-vis what's happening with opportunity zones.
Want to add anything to that?
Just ditto to everything that I said. I mean, I would also like to see just kind of a more keen eye on just good actors versus maybe not so ones, and maybe it's ones that are actually able, like you said, just in terms of metrics, not just dollars deployed, but how many jobs generated from that, or just kind of multiplying effects from that. I think that's definitely more impactful rather than just a bank saying we underwritten $1 million this year, we're done. It's like it's not quite. Like yes, that may be your goal, but that's not what the ultimate goal is intended for.
And if I could just pick up on something you said, David, I think the ability to use data more creatively to try to understand the issues here is definitely in front of us. 21st Century Cities did a project this year looking at deposit flows into the city of Baltimore and small business lending in the city of Baltimore. And we saw over 10 years a doubling of deposits and a 30% drop in small business lending. And some of that speaks to the change nationally in banking practice and how larger banks are changing the way they interact with small businesses. But it's not too hard to get the facts. And it's important to use facts to try to drive good policy making in this area. So we do have that opportunity in front of us now to rethink how we measure these things.
Absolutely.
And just speaking of data, which offers so much opportunity, coming back to you for a minute, David, could you talk about how your firm uses data and how you might be able to connect investors with opportunities and how that might work in what you do?
Sure. We're huge data nerds. We love to be able to, I mean, nothing excites investors more than a data set that can be sorted and resorted. But the way that we think about leveraging data isn't necessarily sort of for altruistic purposes. Obviously, we're investors. We want to put $1 in the machine and get more than $1 out of the machine. And so for us, it's all about looking to leveraging the data to create signals. And how can we either de-risk an investment? How can we find other opportunities that we can go in and say, let's find the most obscure thing, right? Like, let's say a company's Twitter mentions explode, 300%. Like, that's a data signal. And how can we take that individual signal and sort of bracket back to say, well, what's happening there? Are their customers growing? Is this an indicator that this company is on the move? Should we dive in and call them up and see if they're ready to take investment? And so all of those signals we try to synthesize and contextualize in a way that we can make them actionable. And then the other big thing that we leverage is leveraging the data through our local partners. I mean, one of the things that we're really involved in is by going to 40 cities, we've got thousands of people in our network. We'd like to help empower them to make better decisions as it results to them looking for companies and finding opportunity and highlighting really good entrepreneurs that we think potentially deserve backing. And so for us, the conversation, data is the new sort of language of the conversation. How can we extract the right signals to create these real opportunities and then accelerate the time that we can go after and sort of actually capitalize on those opportunities? So we look at it as a very powerful tool that's only getting more powerful as, in the prior generation of investing, the data was somebody keying it into a database. Now that database is populated automatically by Internet of Things types of data devices, but beacons as you walk into a store starts to tell Macy's exactly what sweater you're looking at. How can we leverage that data to make better investment decisions, and create better products around that?
Terry.
I hope Macy's isn't targeting me. I'm like, oh boy, that's
I think they
bad.
already are.
I think they already are.
It's too late.
I know.
I think it's happening.
Yeah, I know. I guess it is. Yeah, I get those flashes online for sure. So yeah, we're all using data, right? Data is just at the heart of everything. And I would just, echo a lot of what David said. When I just gave you that example before about a healthcare, large health system investing with us, that took about 2 years lead time. Some of this stuff takes a long time to get it through all the process. But the biggest thing they wanted to know is, how do we know we're going to move the dial? We love the idea, but can you show me the data to show that we actually can really change health outcomes or healthcare utilization or whatever data set they want, and that they'll have returns that they want? So we said, not really. We can't really show you all of that. And so we embarked over the last 2 years of really strengthening our kind of use of data and technology as something we think will be a great lever for us. And we launched something called Opportunity 360, which is a curated data platform, which simply it answers the question of a healthcare person who's saying, if all this cross-sector work is working in a community, how do we know what are the best pathways to invest in? What are the best interventions? How do we know we were effective? How can we look at time A or time B? Or if we're LA and we want to compare ourselves to New York or whoever, do we have data sets that allow us to do that on various dimensions? So we kind of took our underwriting practice for the last 35 years of investing in communities and what works? What do we know about what does opportunity mean? What are some of the metrics we would want to look at? We looked at some best research out there and all of our markets where we're working in hundreds of communities across the country, and we created this data platform. And it puts the notion of home at the center because the biggest pocketbook issue for the people we serve is housing cost. The biggest determinant of place, if you're a place-based investor, is your home, right? And so that's an essential part, and we found a lot of the other data platforms didn't really recognize the value of having home at the center, but then we crowded around things like the infrastructure, the mobility questions, transportation, economic security, jobs, education. How do we crowd those adjacencies around and get the right metrics so that we can work with educators, healthcare professionals, cities to look at these data sets? And so we crowded in a lot of data. We tried to make it much more ground truth by having some resident engagement attached to it. Real time. A lot of us work in opportunity zones. You're looking at data that is 10 years old and you're wondering, how is a community changing or is there displacement? We cannot work with those kind of data platforms. So making it more real time, resident infused, and then how do we align it so that we're all much more efficient in our use of data? So a healthcare organization does something called a community health needs assessment. That needs assessment is based off a set of data. And it may or may not include housing, yet they know that housing is a fundamental social determinant of health. So how do we make sure that those data platforms are starting to talk to each other, there's commonalities, and how do we bring those together? So that's a quest we're on, and it's an exciting one, and I hope it will make us more effective and efficient.
Terrific.
Yeah.
So Billy, your city, your mayor has a reputation for being very data-driven. Could
Very.
you maybe talk a little bit about how that figures in economic development?
Yeah, he's really kind of catered his whole administration around it. I think it just comes to the core of, what he tried to accomplish. And if you don't know where you are and where you're going to go, then how are you really going to be effective? And so, we made great strides in the past few years. From the city of Los Angeles being off the radar to the #1 digital city, #1 open data city. We've just let all our data out for everyone to see. I mean, in true transparency, anyone could go into our traffic data and just tell us, oh, there could be something wrong. And so, that's kind of a major theme for us. And then where it comes into place for us on a day-to-day basis is really kind of, it helps me kind of organize and prioritize my departments just in terms of their priorities and their strategy. and specifically with placemaking. So for one example, our planning department has also done major improvements on just collecting data. And we recently passed a program called the Transit-Oriented Communities, which is basically intended to develop more affordable housing around transit stops. And so this incentive or this initiative that we offer to the developers is saying, you know, if you're a developer and you build housing around a transit stop and you build additional deep subsidized affordable housing, so I'm talking about very low income and low income, which is very hard to come by just because of the deep subsidy, your project is by right, meaning you don't have to go through the planning process, which takes months. Just drop your plans, come to the counter, we'll sign off on the permit, you're good to go. And so that has spurned a lot. We've, you know, that program started, you know, maybe a year ago. We've already developed, like, we have about 5,000 units that's approved and under construction. And so it's pretty strong. And, you know, we're kind of mapping where a lot of that activity is taking place. And that's just the private sector alone on it being proactive, on its own initiative, identifying opportunities. And so we kind of saw neighborhoods where that was growing. And then what we want to do is overlay other initiatives on top of that, whether it's maybe a facade program for businesses along that corridor, that there's a lot of this activity going on. And then on the proactive side for us, maybe we need to incentivize other areas where we see there's not enough activity. And so, you know, we love data, we love maps, you know, we work with Esri a lot. We kind of have a long-term partnership with them, very deep. I think they're sick of us calling on them. But, you know, it's very key for us, you know, as was mentioned, you know, things are constantly changing. We want to get ahead of the curve. And then, you know, I will say also for us, you know, just in terms of economic development for Los Angeles, I totally agree with you, David, that, you know, you have to do it the right way. You can't, it's not just all about recruiting corporations or headquarters, you know. You need to go where, you know, you make the most impact. For us, and for me specifically, I've seen what would help the businesses the most, honestly, is making sure the city can provide the basic city services. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You know, CEOs, employees, they want to know there's, you know, public safety, their streets are being cleaned, the trees are being trimmed, just basic city services. And so, you know, we just need to be sure, we use a lot of data for that as well, just in terms of trash pickups. We develop an app that a constituent can say, I did this actually just before I left for this trip. There was an illegal dumping across my house. I opened my app, took a picture, reported it, and hopefully it should be picked up by now. I don't know if it is. But just using this, we'll see. I'll let you know. I'll report the results. But it's that instantaneous, you know, kind of connection between the constituents of the city and just basically calling on these city services. Mobility is going to be a whole nother world that now I'm diving into, for better, for worse. I mean, definitely for better. You know, AV definitely also makes me nervous, but we're going to go really big on that pretty soon. You know, we've seen a lot of that already. I mean, I actually, you know, walking around Baltimore, saw bird scooters, which is great. You know, probably not the best way to work with cities, but they're an LA company. I love them. They're great. We'll see. But just, you know, we try to encourage companies like that to really work with the city and access our data so that, you know, if they're deploying in certain neighborhoods, that it makes the most sense, not only near last mile transit stops, but other employment centers, you know, and in just other connections that make sense. So, you know, we're constantly opening up as much as we can because, again, along this theme of P3s, you know, it takes a two-way street to communicate, and, you know, we're happy to give all our data away to any company that wants to. You know, I think for us, that we offer that business opportunity for companies, whether it's a startup, you know, and I've done this a lot, you know, one of the best gifts I can give them is a B2B or just a work with the city. There's a Boingo Wireless is a company in Westwood, and they offer hotspots and Wi-Fi wireless services. And they wanted to put Wi-Fi in our airport. I said, okay, done. You know, I connected them, and they worked it out, and now they're our provider for Wi-Fi in the airport. So, you know, we try to offer that as much as possible.
I think that's a great example of being hospitable to growth and private sector involvement. We have a little less than 10 minutes left. I want to open this up to questions. We have great panelists, so if people have questions, please step forward. If we have time, then I'm going to ask each of the panelists for a parting thought on, you know, best ideas on driving private capital to areas that need opportunities. And I wanted to just take 1 minute to just plug a little bit a report that's coming out this week from 21st Century Cities, where we actually looked at venture capital flows to 252 startups over the last 12 years in Baltimore to track the capital raised, the jobs created, the retention rate, and really the sectors that are driving investment in Baltimore. And it to me, was a hugely beneficial exercise in understanding from data where the opportunities are. So the more we can collect that data, the more we can inform our choices, I think. So, okay, we have a question here. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Jerry Roll, I'm the director of the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, headquartered in Hazard, Kentucky. In my service area, we have about 1 million people, but not one city with more than 10,000 people in it. And this is sort of for the whole panel, and I'll pick on David a little bit, because Rise of the Rest has actually made an investment in one of my communities that seems to be struggling a little.
The investment or the community?
Huh?
Which is struggling, the investment or the community?
The investment, both. The investment. So my question is, in communities like mine, we don't have the infrastructure that you're talking about. We don't have anchors. We don't have data. We have a lot of old, empty, dilapidated buildings. We have a lot of work to do in capacity building. And like most of the South and Middle America, you know, where we get our water and our energy and our food, venture capital still feels a bit extractive. We're going to need some investment that is going to have a negative return, or is going to have zero return, or is purely philanthropic. And so my question is this. Do any of you feel like, you know, venture capital is getting a lot of press about this is going to save us all. It's not going to save Middle America. It's not going to save rural places like mine. It's not going to solve persistent poverty in the middle of the country. Do you feel like that matters? And if it does, is there potential for us to think differently about how we stack up capital to get places like mine ready for that venture capital? And, you know, it's got to come from Silicon Valley or places like that, but I think we have to look a little deeper. Do you see that happening, or are we excited enough about what's going on in inner cities and urban places to say that's all that matters? We did pick president. Just saying.
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question to answer, and obviously, you know, and even some of the work with the opportunity zones is saying that, you know, the tracks that have been selected aren't just urban tracks in big, you know, multi-million person cities, but it's sort of, it's a broad dispersion across the country of urban, of rural, and so that it can pick up and find these pockets of where people have been, a lot of the people have been left behind. And so as a result, yeah, I mean, venture capital is not going to be the save-all for those types of communities. But luckily, in what we were thinking was, it's an accelerant. If we can inject the capital first, perhaps others will follow, and others who have different risk profiles, right? The good thing is that both with the amount of like extreme wealth that has said, you know, I'm not going to be just I'm not going to be just a philanthropist. I'm going to be a venture philanthropist, and I'm going to invest money into ideas and into thinking. I was just reading about Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and how they're looking to cure all disease. I mean, how audacious is that? That's not necessarily going to be done only in Silicon Valley. That's got to be done across the country. And so the idea is, how do we make your community and communities like yours both create this network density so that it's not sort of one town of 10,000 people trying to fight for this, but it's stitching 3 or 4 towns. So now it's like 50,000 people playing for a little bit more. And can those towns sort of figure out what they are unique at and how they can sort of pull that uniqueness together to say, hey, look at us. We're not New York. We're attractive for these 4 or 5 reasons. And I think figuring how to do that and how to appeal to the different capital spectrums and different streams of capital from debt to venture philanthropy all the way up to venture capital is one interesting way of being able to like match the risk and return profile with the actual investment. Some of it's got to be infrastructure, and a lot of that's got to be funded, frankly, by government, I think, because it's roads and bridges and schools, and in this country we decided that governments do that best. But in terms of redevelopment and sort of putting some of those empty buildings back in use, opportunity zones can be an amazing vehicle for reinvigorating those buildings. But I think it's a big problem, and it's going to take a lot of smart people and dedicated people working on a handful of solutions, irrespective of sort of how that community is going to work itself to pull up and sort of create new opportunities.
Okay. Let's take one more question, and then if you all want to weigh in on any of that as well. But let's hear your question. And
Rob Grunwald from the Minneapolis Fed, and just regarding the Amazon Challenge, I appreciated your observations, David, about bringing communities together. Another narrative that I see is the Amazon Challenge got local governments to start promising away their tax base in the future and to see who could drive that as low as possible. The Minneapolis Fed has done some research looking at that bidding war between state and local governments. It's on our website. How do local governments deal with that tension between promising incentives to local companies, but recognizing that that could be a fool's errand, and instead focus on their core ingredients of economic development?
So I'll kick off this with a really quick story. So in Washington, D.C., one of the big startup incubators called 1776, for all of you who might know from Washington, D.C., basically lobbied the government to get some kind of heavily discounted rent for a year, I think was the term of the rent abatement or rent deal they got with the city. Through there have come hundreds of companies that are now employing probably 1,000 or more people, all of whom either live in the District of Columbia or work in the District of Columbia, but more importantly, pay taxes in the District of Columbia. So if I work for the city and I think about the ROI holistically from that 12 months of free rent, it pales in comparison to the revenue generated, let alone sort of the multiplier effect from people coming to those offices and spending money in the coffee shops and restaurants and on the metro tokens that have all generated from that one investment. And so I think that it's thinking about clever strategies like that and thinking more holistic about ROI.
Okay, I'm getting the message. We have a minute left, so I am going to go to lightning round and ask each of you to just a parting thought, and if you want to direct it towards one of these questions or something else you'd like to share, please go ahead.
Well, I have a takeaway that from David, in order to grow startups, you need kombucha and napkins in abundance. So that's on my to-do list. I think just to that question, just about the HQ2 and tax incentives in a theoretical sense, because I'm under an NDA with Amazon, but I think, to David's point, the benefit there was the cities to get their act together and tell that story in narrative and do some very deep digging, some soul searching about what they want to do and put together a visioning document. And I think from there you can decide whether or not incentives are needed. I think, from LA standpoint, just in general, again, incentives are not for us, kind of a big talking point. But for other cities, for other parts of the country, I can definitely see the value of that. Time will tell whether you get that ROI, but I think you just have to be careful about that discussion about what it takes and just kind of those milestones of what you get in return, because I think the cities and municipalities usually get shortchanged in those conversations and aren't aggressive enough about asking for their cake and then some.
Terry, parting thought?
Just parting thought, I guess I would say thank you for the audience engagement. I think that the question you asked about rural communities, it's really vexing. It's super hard. Enterprise, one of the primary things we do is to do capacity building for that very reason. And, I said we worked in, we have a consulting group that goes out and worked in 500 communities last year, and we have a dedicated rural and tribal effort. And actually, we just released with the Minneapolis Fed a home ownership book for tribal nations, because it's very hard to do, right? So I guess what that leads me to believe is just to say it is very hard. I don't think any of us think Opportunity Zone money is going to flow in any way to those rural communities without a really very specific, dedicated strategy and more. So I guess I would just say that I think that's where I think intellectual capital, financial capital really needs to meet up and think about the new solutions. I do think there are things like, drawing the regional sort of boundaries as opposed to single boundaries, I think helps. And I think there's other strategies that can come into play, but I think it's really hard. And I do hope that, maybe hopeful that as we look to, outsource jobs, maybe we do think about some of the outsourcing strategies that can land in some of those communities. But I think it's that piece is one that I lose a lot of sleep over. So I would just say eyes wide open on that, and thank you for the comment, and we'll be thinking about it. And I would be also happy to connect folks who are in the rural, business. I would say a couple things. One is the Federal Reserves have been, they're hosting this conference. They've been great partners across the country, and we'd be happy to talk about our work in rural communities, but every community is different, right?
Okay. I think we need to stop, but do you want to just say one thing?
Thanks to you, Mary. You did
There you go.
an amazing job moderating this panel. Thank you so much.
This is a great panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.